Okay, we may have to turn that fan off, though.
If you want it off, I'll turn it off.
She used her 3'7" reach wingspan.
Show did, man. All right, guys, it's true crime time again. We hope you've all had a great week so far, and if not, we hope that this brings you a little dark joy. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Taylor. And this is
Pure Malice. If you're listening on Spotify, go ahead and tap that follow button for us. It really helps our show, and it keeps you in the loop on new episodes.
This week, we're back with part 4 of the Lake Waco Murders.
Woo!
In episode 3, we left you with David Spence still insisting he was innocent, and his mother, Juanita White, fighting harder than anyone else to prove just that. But after Juanita was murdered, her case cracked open something even darker. Detective Jan Price started seeing problems in the convictions, the informant stories, and the evidence tying everything together. And by the end, she wasn't just questioning Juanita's case anymore. She was questioning whether Waco had gotten the full truth about the Lake Waco murders at all.
That's right. So obviously Price is not just thinking about Juanita's case anymore. By this point, she's also looking back at the Lake Waco convictions, and she tells Hall that she hopes the truth, whatever it is, whoever it implicates.
I'm so sorry, do that again.
Little throat gurgly noises.
That was like the weirdest gurgle. And it almost sounded like an echo.
It did almost echo. I thought you did it twice in a row.
No, just one time. It's like it was delayed.
Listen, with this mic, you can hear everything. Okay. She hopes the truth, whatever it is, whoever it implicates, comes out in the retrials. Because while they had been buried in Juanita's case, the Lake Waco appeals have started up in the background. And one of the biggest developments comes from Muneer Deeb. Not long after Muneer is sent to death row, he starts questioning whether trusting lawyers with his life had actually gotten him anywhere. And somewhere along the line, he makes a decision that honestly sounds almost impossible. He decides he's going to learn the law himself so he can represent himself better than a licensed lawyer could. And with that, he began fighting for his own life. And guys, I really did try to sit with that because on one hand, he's already been convicted. He's on death row. So maybe in his mind, the worst had already happened. He felt like maybe there was nothing left to lose. But that is a terrifying gamble. Like, I can tell you 100% if I'm ever in that situation where my life is literally on the line, you will not find me trying to be the next Elle Woods. I'm hiring a real lawyer. Someone who's already passed the bar and now gets paid to do it for a living.
I don't know. I might bend and snap.
I mean, I could definitely bend and snap, but I'm just not trying to be a lawyer, man.
It's not in the shower.
Definitely not. Definitely not in the shower, guys. Oh. But Muneer Deeb somehow becomes one of the very few cases where that gamble actually paid off. For more than 6 years while he was on death row, he goes to the prison library, he sits there with these dense legal books, teaches himself the language, and according to Hall, he even types out legal documents word for word so he can absorb how they are written. The style, the structure, the rhythm of it. And eventually, he finally believes he's ready. So he writes a writ of habeas corpus, more than 100 pages long. And he sends it in to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and he waits for what probably felt like an eternity until finally the impossible happens. He actually wins 100% on his own. Muneer Deeb gets his conviction overturned. And just for reference, from 1980 to 1989, the Texas criminal appeal reversal rate was somewhere between 10% and 12%. So I say that just to show you that it really was a rare thing. I mean, it's even more rare today. So yeah, the court overturns his conviction after finding that hearsay had been improperly admitted during the original trial. And because of that, Muneer Deeb is granted a new trial, which obviously is massive.
Yeah. And while it doesn't erase every question around him, It doesn't have to, because this filing isn't about answering every suspicious thing in the case. It's about whether his original trial was fair, whether improper evidence came in, and whether that error was serious enough to give him another shot in court. And according to the court's response to his appeal, it was. So, do you remember that insurance policy that Muneer took out on Gail Kelly?
Yes, I do.
Well, per usual, with anything connected to Simons, the story we had in the beginning wasn't the whole story. Later, it turned out that Muneer had taken out a similar policy on multiple employees, not just Gail Kelly. And while this doesn't change the way that detail looks, and obviously doesn't answer everything, because the big question that many people cannot get past still remains, why did he list himself as the common law husband on her insurance policy? Like, did he list himself as that on every employee's life insurance policy?
Probably not.
Yeah.
But we don't know.
I was going to say, we just don't have a clear answer to that. So Muneer does get a new trial. However, David Spence and the Melendez brothers don't get that same break. And while Muneer has been teaching himself the law and writing his own ticket off death row, David Spence is running out of time, as his execution date, which was set for October 17th of 1991, gets closer and closer. So over the summer of 1991, the Texas Resource Center, which is a nonprofit that provides pro bono representation to people on death row, enters the picture. And at that time, they're drowning in cases. And as we know, every death row case comes with a clock ticking in the background. So needless to say, the TRC can't handle everything in-house, and sometimes they have to bring outside attorneys to help. Local attorneys, volunteer attorneys, pretty much anyone that's qualified and willing to step onto the playing field. And that becomes the problem with David's case. Finding someone willing to step into this arena, it's not an easy task.
Definitely would not be.
So obviously, everyone who's anybody already knows what he's in for. And it's not that hard to understand why people might not want to take the case on, especially if you only know the case from the outside, because looking outside in, David Spence is a monstrous killer. And let's face it, even if you're looking at the case from the inside out, it would still be a challenging case. One that not everybody would want to get involved in. But eventually, his case is finally assigned to 2 in-house attorneys on Labor Day weekend of 1991. So we're like a month away.
Yeah, not long.
So now that doesn't give his new attorneys, Rob Owens and Raul Shulman, a whole lot of time. But Rob and Raul are up for the challenge, especially once they open David's file and they get into the nitty-gritty.
When they look over all the details, they see that the bulk of the case against David is mostly signage, bite marks, and snitches. And even
snitches get stitches.
Not in this case. They got deals and special privileges and conjugal visits.
I know. They got out of prison, too.
Sure did. And even though the Texas Forensic Science Commission didn't really cast serious doubt on the bite mark evidence until much later, his new attorneys were skeptical. They also start realizing that a lot of evidence in the case has not been disclosed to David's original defense team. And that's a problem. A Brady violation kind of problem. So just to break this down really quick, because it matters, a Brady violation happens when prosecutors fail to turn over evidence that could be favorable to the defense. That can mean evidence that points towards the defendant's innocence, evidence that suggests they may not have been involved, evidence that could reduce their sentence, or evidence that could damage the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses or the government's case. And the second part is important too, because it's not just about evidence that says, hey, this person did not do this. It can also include impeachment evidence, meaning anything that could make a jury question a witness's credibility. So things like deals that were made with informants, promises of leniency, prior inconsistent statements, or records that raise concern about police misconduct.
Which, I feel like we were exposed to a lot of that by information after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
But it did seem like a lot of that was not presented originally.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. So basically, if the prosecution has evidence that could help the defense challenge the case being built against their client, they're supposed to turn it over. And here's the part that people sometimes miss. The defense does not have to ask for it by name. Prosecutors have a duty to disclose it. And intent does not erase the problem, meaning it doesn't matter if someone says that they forgot or they didn't realize that this evidence was inside of this file. The prosecution is generally responsible for evidence known to law enforcement and other government agencies involved in the case. Now, legally, for it to rise to the level of a Brady violation that can actually affect a conviction, the withheld evidence has to be material, meaning there has to be a responsible probability that... Was that you?
No. Somebody whistled out there.
Oh, well, she does whistle a lot. I'm like, wait, there's a ghost. Okay, anyways. That threw me off. Meaning there has to be a reasonable probability that if the defense had known about it, the outcome of the trial could have been different. And in a case like this, so much of the story depends on informants, shifting statements, and evidence that already feels shaky. The question becomes pretty obvious. What did the defense not know? And what would the jury have done if they heard it? What?
Whenever you said shaky, it just reminds me of like Wild and Out where he's like, that was shaky.
I don't know.
Oh.
So have you figured out what we're talking about yet? Just in case you haven't and you need a refresher, here's a playback of what we're talking about.
Take it back now, y'all.
Now, investigators also know that when the same detail surfaces over and over, it demands attention. And as they waited, they started to notice a theme emerging in the tips that were coming in. And that theme was the alleged drug use among the kids, specifically Kenneth. So tipsters claimed Kenneth was known to use drugs. Now, it's important to mention here that none of the families reported any known drug use. Everything investigators were hearing was coming from the tip line. And if you don't recall last episode, we talked about that those tips can sometimes be like painfully specific. So they included a name other than Kenneth's as well. A local dealer named Terry Lee Harper, also known as Tab.
That is not a very gangster-like name, dude.
I mean, Tab.
I mean, it's not even a tough name. It doesn't sound tough at all. It sounds like, I don't know.
Sounds like he's a gossip queen.
Right?
Like the tabloid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, according to multiple tips, Kenneth allegedly owed Tab nearly $3,000.
Dang.
And they said that Tab was running out of patience. Tab wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. They actually knew him pretty well. But they know him as a criminal who dealt in misdemeanors and the occasional low-grade felony, not murder. A low-level guy. So murder would be a massive escalation for this guy. But in this case, where investigators had more questions than answers, they couldn't afford to ignore it. Because if Kenneth really did owe the wrong person money, this might not be so random at all.
Absolutely. No one was ruling Tab out, especially because, according to multiple people, Tab himself had been going around town taking credit for the murders.
Like, no, why are you going to do that, sir?
Dude. And I know we see it in cases all the time, but like how stupid. Just like in Elmer McCurdy that we talked about.
Like, come on now.
I mean, people could be bragging about this to sound tough, trying to build a reputation in their own egos. I mean, who knows? And in this case, it's possible Tab was claiming responsibility for another reason entirely. If people believed that he was capable of doing something like this, it made him more intimidating. It made it easier to control people through fear and to collect money from them.
Which is a good point.
It is.
Gives you more street credit, especially for somebody who is like so low grade.
That makes a difference in the scene, you know? But then another detail surfaces. Multiple witnesses placed Tab at Caney Park the very night that the 3 kids were murdered. And suddenly, this isn't just street talk. This is more than one person placing him at one of the last known locations of the victims. But just as Tab is rising to the top of their radar, everything changes. The toxicology results come back in early August. And according to reporting by Bill Moore in the Waco Tribune-Herald, all 3 victims were clean. No drugs, no alcohol, completely clean.
I mean, I feel like that complicates it more because, you know, you have these rumors or speculations like money owed to this drug dealer.
Supposedly.
But if somebody is spending that much money on those drugs, unless they're like using it as a secondary gain of selling themselves, which is probably unlikely as well, it's going to make that $3,000 drug debt pretty unlikely.
Exactly right. It's far-fetched for sure. In fact, those tox results don't just weaken the theory, they dismantle it. And then something even more shocking happens. On September 9th, Simons is walking past Detective Salinas' desk, and the Lake Waco murder files just happens to be sitting out. And I think that probably Simons couldn't help himself, so he started flipping through it. And he sees a document stating that as of September 3rd, the Lake Waco murder cases had been classified as quote-unquote officially inactive.
So back then, they abandoned that lead about Tab almost immediately. And honestly, you can choose whatever excuse makes the most sense to you. But it turns out those witness reports were not disclosed until much later. The reports about him allegedly being seen at Caney Park and the reports about him allegedly bragging that he had been involved in the triple murder, none of that was turned over to David's original defense team when it mattered most.
Which is so crazy.
Mm-hmm. And then there was this polygraph involving Kenneth's dad, Richard Franks. Now listen, before anybody starts throwing polygraph results around like they're the gospel, let's be clear. Polygraphs are polygraphs and that's it. Like, they're not admissible in court. They aren't magic truth machines or courtroom crystal balls. But this one does come up when you start looking into the case. So, of course, we're going to address it.
Yeah.
Especially because it contains one of those details that without context, it can send people spiraling in the wrong direction. According to Hall, there was a short period of time when Richard Franks was getting some extra scrutiny because of discrepancies about when he first went to the parks to look for the kids. So 12 days after the murders, Richard sat for the polygraph. Hall writes that the polygraph was ultimately inconclusive but strange. According to the report, toward the end of the test, Richard became extremely upset and said, "Oh God, I was with them every minute, all night when they were killed." And he also said, "I don't have any guilt feelings about causing their deaths." And I know hearing that, your brain immediately wants to grab onto it because it sounds strange. It makes you pause and just think like, wait, what? Like, what is he talking about? But this is where I think we have to really be careful. According to the Crime Junkie podcast, they had reached out to members of Jill's family, including her mom, Nancy, her aunt, Jan, her brother, Brad, and her sister, Monica. And the one thing that stood out from the reporting is that even within Jill's family, not everyone agrees on every detail. But Nancy's perspective on what Richard Franks supposedly said during that polygraph is the part I really want to sit with for a second. According to Crime Junkie, Nancy understood that feeling. She said that on the night of the murders, she was awake all night feeling like something was wrong, that she could understand what Richard meant when he said he feels like he was with them all night. Because in her own way, she felt like she was with Jill all night too. So it's easy to sit where we're all sitting and analyze every word just like it's evidence. Yeah. But Nancy wasn't hearing his words as some random person looking back at the case file. She was hearing them as a mother who lived through the exact same local nightmare from the other side. So the fact that Nancy can look at Richard's words through grief instead of suspicion says a lot.
I agree.
The way she gives Richard the benefit of understanding, knowing the kind of pain that he was carrying, is not something that we should just dismiss. Nancy's perspective matters emotionally. And when it comes to what Richard said, I think that there are only a handful of people who can understand the kind of grief from the inside.
Yeah, and it's powerful, you know?
Yeah. It's easy to just twist words, right? Like, it's easy to hear something and think what you want to think about it.
It is. I mean, our minds are very creative and imaginative anyway, so it comes up with all kinds of things, especially without all of the context. So with all of these serious potential Brady issues starting to surface, David's execution doesn't move forward as planned. A last-minute stay is granted, and his execution date is pushed back to December 19th. Now that the execution clock has loosened its grip ever so slightly, Rob and Raul finally have a small window to keep digging. So they start going back through the people who helped build the case against David, especially the informants. And one of the first names they track down is Jesse Ivy. Jesse tells them the story he gave about David confessing was not true. But what he says next is even bigger. According to Jesse, he didn't just make up a story. He was being used as a pipeline. Paul quotes Jesse saying, "You could say that Truman Simons and Ned Butler put the facts of the case in my mouth, and I put them into the mouths of other guys." Then Kevin Michael signs an affidavit too, and his story points in the same direction. According to Kevin Michael, Simons regularly gave him confidential case information that he shouldn't have had. Then, later, when Kevin repeated those same details back in statements, Simons acted surprised, like Kevin had somehow come up with this information all on his own. And this is where the informant structure starts looking less like separate witnesses independently confirming each other and more like the same story being passed around, recycled, and dressed up as cooperation. And even though these recantations are not coming in one clean, simple wave, they are still coming. And each one makes the original story feel a little more manufactured. But none of this fixes everything overnight. The next year and a half becomes a brutal stretch of back and forth of breakthroughs that never quite broke through. And then, around August of 1992...
Baby Taylor was a few months old.
That's right. Welcome, Taylor. Rob Owens leaves TRC for another opportunity. And another attorney, Joel Schwartz, that makes me think of Vanderpump Rules. Schwartz. Okay, anyways. Steps in to help. And while all of this is happening, Raul is also visiting Tony and Gilbert in prison. Both of them tell him, plainly, that anything they said or testified to that implicated David was false. But saying that privately and saying it officially are two very different things, and they aren't willing to come forward, assign their names to it, and put themselves directly in the line of fire.
Yeah.
And that matters because both Tony and Gilbert are scheduled to testify for the prosecution again in Muneer's retrial, which is set for December of 1992. So the question is, why privately say the testimony was false, but still be willing to walk into court and help the prosecution tell that same false story all over again? And I think that the answer to that is layered. First, these men have already seen what happens when the wrong people are leading the case.
Yeah.
So I don't think that they had a lot of faith that telling the truth would suddenly make the system work the way it's supposed to. Not whenever they had already watched this case turn into exactly what it became. But there's another piece too. There's this vague suggestion from Simons and Fazell that if Tony and Gilbert keep cooperating, maybe things will go better for them whenever they eventually come up for parole. So once again, we're back in that same gray area. Not necessarily a clean written deal with a bow on top, but a suggestion, a wink, a possibility. The kind of thing that can hang over someone in prison and still do exactly what it's meant to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the third piece. And this one may have been the heaviest. At this point, nobody has been convicted of Raylene's murder. Not David, not Muneer, not Tony, not Gilbert. The state of Texas may have agreed to not seek the death penalty against Tony and Gilbert for Jill and Kenneth's murder, but Raylene's case was still sitting there, untouched. So even if no one said it out loud, the pressure was obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So Gilbert and Tony had their own futures and their own risks to think about. But then, in what some believe was a reward for staying on their best behavior, the two brothers were allowed to see each other for the first time in nearly a decade. And the timing of this is important because Muneer's retrial is about to start. That is why Gilbert and Tony were even in the same facility, in the same city at the same time. And something about that meeting changed things. Maybe it reminded them what they had already lived through. Maybe it reminded them of what their testimony had helped create. Maybe after all these years apart, they finally had enough. Whatever the reason, they both made the same decision. Whatever happened next happens. But they were not going to get back on the stand and perjure themselves again to help put another man back on death row now.
Mm-hmm.
So when Muneer's retrial begins, Gilbert and Tony refuse to testify. And this time, Muneer is acquitted, which is a shock to almost everyone, but probably no one more than Truman Simons and Vic Fazell.
Oh, I can only imagine their faces.
Because this was not how the story was supposed to go. Not after years of convictions, death sentences, informants, testimonies, and the state's versions of events being treated like the final word. And after Muneer's acquittal, Raul and Joel start hearing from people inside law enforcement who say they had doubted the case against all four men for a very long time. Which, I mean, better late than never. But where were those voices like earlier on in the cases?
Right.
Because at this point, David had been on death row. Muneer had been on death row, and Tony and Gilbert had been living under the weight of convictions tied to a case that even people inside the system apparently didn't fully believe in. And some of those doubts came from people in Waco, including Marvin Horton, Chief Scott, and, of course, Detective Jan Price. Now, Price was not part of the original Lake Waco investigation, so that one is just a little bit different in my opinion. But still, once the cracks are exposed, it's obvious. All of these people who had questioned the case from the sidelines started mattering in a new way. Because now it's not just Raul and Joel saying something went wrong. It is also people who have been in or around the system saying that they never fully brought the path that led investigators to David, Muneer, and the Melendez brothers in the first place.
Chief Scott is interesting here because he's the one who had trusted Simons with the case in the first place. But he was also in charge when Simons got humiliated after Muneer was released following that 3-hour polygraph way back at the beginning. And remember, Marvin Kitty Horton, they called him Kitty, but I love Kitty. That's a cute name. I wish you had a little girl and you could name her Kitty.
Yeah, no.
She's like, yeah, no.
Reminds me of that 70s show.
I know. That's why I love it. I love Kitty. Anyways, so remember that Horton had been furious whenever Simons detained Muneer in the first place. According to Hall, Horton basically lit into Simons and Bear in front of everyone and told them that they had messed up the whole thing. But it's hard not to look back and think, okay, then where was the bigger fight,
Yeah.
Because yes, he had said something, he pushed back, but then the case kept moving in a different direction,
Yeah.
And David, Muneer, Tony, and Gilbert were still pulled into the version of events that Simons was building. So by now, the damage had already been done, and people who helped hold this case together are starting to peel away one by one. One after another, pieces of the case are either recanting, backing away, or looking way less solid than they did the first time around. And for Raul and Joel, that leaves one major piece still standing, Homer Campbell's bite mark testimony. That becomes the last major piece still holding the state's case upright. The last thing they still have to discredit before the state's version of the Lake Waco murders starts completely crumbling.
So they put together a panel of 5 expert odontologists to take part in a blind experiment. The idea was to see if these experts could match anonymous dental molds to the autopsy pictures that supposedly showed bite marks. And one of those molds was David's. So according to Paul's reporting...
It was really good recording. He really did do a good job in reporting it.
He was amazing. So according to Paul, one expert said that photos were so poor in quality that he refused to compare them to the molds at all. A second expert wrote that the marks were more likely than not made by insects or artifacts, and said that if the purpose of the exercise was to match those marks to a set of teeth, it borders on unbelievable. A third expert thought some contusions on one body were probably human bite marks, but he could not match any of the molds to them. And then the last 2 experts, they did make a match, but it was not David Spence. It belonged to a housewife from Phillipsburg, Kansas.
Yeah.
The Housewives of Kansas City.
Is that a real one?
No.
I didn't think so. It didn't sound very fancy, but...
No. Well, the Housewives of Phillipsburg, Kansas.
Yeah, it sounds fancy.
Proper.
Yeah.
That's probably like a little podunk town.
It probably
Shout
is.
out to Phillipsburg. Let us know how big you are.
Yeah.
I'm going to Google it later. An interesting experiment, right?
It is.
Because needless to say, the housewife from Kansas is not a secret suspect who had somehow flown under the radar for all these years. She is the point. She's the blinking red light showing just how shaky the so-called science really was. Red flag.
Yeah, for sure.
Like,
Stands out.
Yeah, like if two experts could look at those marks, look at those molds, and somehow land on a random Karen in, Kansas.
Yes.
A Kansas housewife instead of the man sitting on death row, that's a problem. It's a large problem.
It is. I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah. So, these results, along with 15 different disposition transcripts, are submitted to the court. And for the first time in a long time, there is a tiny flicker of hope. Because now, it's not just David saying he's innocent. It's not just Raul and Joel. There are recantations. People who have been close to the system are finally speaking up and expressing concerns. There are experts looking at the bite mark evidence saying, hey, this doesn't hold up.
Mm-hmm.
Piece by piece, the version of the case that sent David to death row is starting to look less like justice and more like something that should have been questioned a long time ago. And for a moment, it feels like maybe all of that will matter. But in the end, it doesn't.
So on February 16th, 1994, the court determines that none of what they submitted is enough to warrant a new trial. And eventually, David's execution date is set again, this time for April 3rd of 1997.
1995.
That's 1999. Oh.
I know, but I just like 95.
Oh, okay. I'm like, actually, that's still wrong.
I just like 95 better.
All right.
I just feel like that's a good year. I was a whole 3 years old.
Whole 3 years old. Man.
Well, I would have almost been a whole 3 years old.
Almost, yeah. Okay, anyways. So, as hope starts shrinking fast, someone reaches out to a wealthy Texas businessman named Brian Pardo. And surprisingly, he takes an interest in David's case. Bob Herbert later explains part of Pardo's involvement in one of his New York Times opinion pieces about David's case.
I feel like that's bold.
It is. And basically, Pardo goes into it with his mindset of, okay, I'm going to fund this until I find a piece of evidence that proves that he's guilty. And if and when I find that, I'll tap out. But that evidence never comes, at least not for Pardo. Instead, the deeper he looks, the more convinced he becomes that David did not commit these murders. And that is how this conservative, pro-death penalty businessman from Texas ends up spending his own money and sparing no expense, trying to save the life of a man who had been twice convicted of a triple murder. Which means David's already scrappy, stitched-together team suddenly has access to resources that they never could have imagined before. More money, more reach, more ability to chase down the things that had been ignored, buried, or brushed aside. But by then, the clock had already run down. So on April 3rd of 1997, David Spence is strapped to a table in the Texas death chamber. Before the execution is carried out, he makes a few final statements to the victims' family members. According to the Austin American-Statesman, David says, quote, "I want you to understand I speak the truth when I say I didn't kill your kids. I understand your pain. I swear I haven't killed anyone." Then, to his own family, he expresses his love, and within minutes, he's dead.
So, Gilbert Melendez dies in prison just 1 year later from complications related to an illness. Muneer Deeb, who had been acquitted at his retrial, dies from cancer as a free man in 1999.
It's 19. That's not really a party moment. Sorry, he's dead. Okay, sorry.
Stupid.
Sorry.
And Tony Melendez remains in prison until his death behind bars in 2017. As for Calvin Washington and Joe Sidney Williams, Joe's conviction was overturned in 1993. Then, years later,
Yeah.
Then years later, DNA testing pointed to what Detective Jan Price had suspected all along. Calvin and Joe were not the men responsible for what happened to Juanita White. In 2000, DNA evidence implicated Benny Carroll in Juanita's rape and murder. And in 2001, Calvin Washington was finally pardoned by Governor Rick Perry.
That is crazy.
So after everything, the truth in Juanita's case did eventually come out, but only after years of damage had already been done. And we want to touch on Benny Carroll a little bit more. So Benny Carroll was not some random name that only appeared years later because of DNA. The Houston Chronicle and the Justice Project report similarly state that Carroll had admitted to raping an elderly neighbor of White's 2 months before her death. And according to other reporting on the case, there was another nearby attack not long after Juanita's murder, where a woman was sexually assaulted, beaten with a hammer, left for dead, and survived long enough to identify Benny Carroll as her attacker. So when Jan Price looked at Juanita's case and thought Calvin Washington and Joe Sidney Williams did not fit, she wasn't just guessing. Benny Carroll was already connected to violent sexual offenses in that same neighborhood. And years later, the DNA evidence would point right back to him in Juanita's case. Now, to be clear, I could not confirm a full criminal history for Benny Carroll, but Carroll was never brought into the courtroom for Juanita's murder because by then, he was already dead. So he died by suicide in 1990. And from what I could find, there's no solid public explanation for why. So that answer, like so many in this case, went away with him. So was Juanita's murder happening right when she seemed to be getting closer to exposing serious problems with Simon's Fazell and the Lake Waco convictions really just an awful coincidence? Or was there something more sitting underneath it? We don't know. And honestly, I don't think anyone can responsibly say that as fact without evidence. But the questions are there.
They really are. And this is also where I want to mention something that was sent to us by a source who asked to remain anonymous, because this person is connected to people in this story. And I want to be very clear, we are not presenting every piece of what they said as independently proven facts, but I do think that their messages matter because it shows how deeply this case still lives in and around Waco, even decades later. This source told us they were from outside of Waco, but that they knew Jill and Kenneth from the Methodist home. They said they later met David at Waco High and that they are still very close with David's ex-wife, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And the way they described this case was simple but heavy. They called it a sad, sad story. They also told us very directly to look into Juanita's murder, and obviously we can all understand why. Because Juanita's case did not just become another tragedy connected to this family, it became one of the clearest examples of what can happen when the wrong theory is protected, the wrong people are convicted, and the truth takes years to fight its way back into the light. This source also described what Waco felt like after the murders. They said the city was in an uproar and that people wanted someone to pay. And that matters because that kind of pressure can change the atmosphere around a case. It can make speed look like justice. Whenever a community is grieving, terrified, and demanding answers, the danger is that investigators stop asking who did this and they start asking, can we make this person fit? Our source also talked about David in a way that felt honest. They didn't try to make him sound perfect. Instead, they said David had done bad things, and that whenever they talked to him about his criminal history, he admitted to the things that he had actually done. But according to this person, David always maintained that he did not commit the Lake Waco murders. Their words were, he did some awful things, but not murder. And that is where this case is so complicated, because David Spence was not an easy person to defend in the court of public opinion. He was, by multiple accounts, not someone law enforcement liked, but a person can be guilty of some things and still innocent of the worst thing that they're accused of. And that distinction matters in every case, but especially in a death penalty case.
I mean, I feel like that's the whole reason innocent until proven guilty. Like,
absolutely. Yeah. And maybe the part that stuck with me most is that this person said they wish more people had believed what David and the people closest to him believed back then instead of years later. Because now, for David, it's too late. It's too late for him to benefit from everything that we know about the cases. Too late for him to see his sons file a lawsuit trying to force the state of Texas to answer for what they believe happened. And that is the cruelty of a case like this.
yeah. So with all of that in mind, the question around Juanita's case only gets louder. What drove Simons and Fazell to insist so stubbornly that Calvin Washington and Joe Sidney Williams were their guys? Was it ego? Was it tunnel vision? Was it misconduct? Was it the need to protect the original Lake Waco convictions at all cost? I don't know. But once DNA eventually proved Benny Carroll was responsible for Juanita's murder, it became impossible to look back at the case and not ask these questions. And even after David's execution, there was at least one person who could not let this case go. A renowned investigative journalist named Fred Dannon spent the next several years digging into the Lake Waco murders. And by all accounts, it became an obsession. At one point, Dannon realized that a lot of the evidence from Muneer's 1993 retrial was still in the possession of the special prosecutor, Chapman. So Chapman reportedly had possession of the evidence afterwards because Tarrant County did not have enough storage space, and with the consent of a family member, he could get access to it. And this is where we're going to leave you. I'm Taylor.
And I'm Ryan.
And this is
Pure Malice.
Join us next week for part 5.
Thanks for listening, guys. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe and make sure to follow us on Spotify. It really does help us. We look forward to seeing you next week. Bye, guys.
Toodaloo, motherfucker.
Oh, that's hilarious.